Hey everyone, tonight we begin with something that sounds impossible yet happened countless times across medieval Europe. Men with nothing but determination, basic tools, and an understanding of stone decided to carve fortresses directly into mountainsides and build castles from absolutely nothing. No inheritance, no royal bloodline, no army of workers, just raw ambition and the kind of stubborn persistence that modern people can barely imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a landless knight in 12th century France. No castle, no fortune, no prospects. Your choices are simple. Become a mercenary and die young in someone else's war, or find an impossible cliff face, grab a pickaxe, and spend the next 20 years of your life turning solid rock into home. Surprisingly, many chose the second option. These weren't fairy tale stories. These were real men who looked at vertical stone walls and thought, yes, this will be my dining room. The practice was called castle jacking, though historians prefer the more dignified term opportunistic fortification. It started with a simple observation. Abandoned Roman quarries and natural cave systems dotted the European landscape like forgotten wounds in the earth. Most people saw useless holes. Mountain men saw potential palaces. They'd arrive with little more than iron tools, rope, and an almost supernatural ability to ignore the concept of impossibility. Take the story of Bertrand de Goth, not the Pope, but a lesser-known knight who in 1147 discovered a series of Roman-era caves near what's now the French-Swiss border. The caves were deep, defensible, and completely uninhabitable by normal standards. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling. Bats owned the deeper chambers. The entrance was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Bertrand saw opportunity. He spent the first year just making the caves livable, chiseling drainage channels to redirect the water, widening passages so he could move freely, creating ventilation shafts by following natural fissures in the rock and encouraging them with hammer and chisel. The work was slow, dangerous, and completely solitary. No one wanted to help a madman dig holes in a mountain. But Bertrand understood something that separated successful mountain castle builders from the ones whose bones still litter forgotten cliff faces. Location trumped luxury. His caves sat at the confluence of three major trade routes. Merchants travelling between Italy and northern France had to pass directly beneath his future fortress. More importantly, the mountain provided natural defence on three sides, with only one narrow approach that could be easily fortified. The transformation took 15 years. Bertrand carved living quarters, storage chambers, and even a surprisingly elegant great hall directly into the limestone. He installed wooden floors over the rough stone, hung tapestries to cover the carved walls, and created a surprisingly sophisticated drainage system that kept everything dry. The entrance, once barely wide enough for one person, became a proper gatehouse with murder holes, a portcullis, and arrow slits. By 1162, Bertrand's mountain castle was generating serious income. He charged tolls to passing merchants, offered secure storage for valuable goods, and provided armed escort services through the treacherous mountain passes. What started as a desperate man's last resort had become a profitable business empire carved directly into living rock. The tools these mountain men used were devastatingly simple. Iron pickaxes, wooden wedges, rope, pulleys, and an almost supernatural patience. They understood that stone, despite its appearance, was not uniform. Every type of rock had weak points, natural fracture lines, and preferred directions for breaking. Limestone could be carved with careful, persistent chiseling. Sandstone responded well to wooden wedges driven into natural cracks, then soaked with water until they expanded and split the stone. Granite required a different approach entirely, using fire to heat the rock, then cold water to create thermal shock and fractures. The most successful mountain castle builders weren't just strong, they were geological scholars by necessity. They learned to read stone the way sailors read wind and weather. A successful excavation required understanding which way water would flow, how different stone layers would respond to carving, and where natural weaknesses could be exploited rather than fought against. Consider the techniques used at Château de Baynac in southern France. Though this wasn't built from scratch, but rather carved extensively into an existing cliff face. The builders used a method called progressive undermining. Instead of attacking the stone face directly, they carved horizontal galleries back into the mountain, then used those galleries as staging areas to carve upward and outward. This created a honeycomb of interconnected chambers that could be expanded room by room, year by year. Water management was critical, and often the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Mountain caves naturally collected water from rain, snowmelt, and underground springs. A single miscalculation could flood years of work overnight. Successful builders became expert hydraulic engineers, creating sophisticated channel systems that not only kept their excavations dry, but often provided fresh running water throughout their fortress. The social dynamics of mountain castle building were fascinating and completely different from traditional construction. When a lord built a castle using conventional methods, he employed hundreds of workers, craftsmen, and specialists. Mountain castle builders worked alone or with tiny crews, usually family members or desperate men with nowhere else to go. This created a unique culture of self-reliance and innovation. These solitary builders couldn't rely on established techniques or traditional craftsmen. Every problem required creative solutions. How do you install a wooden floor in a chamber carved from solid rock? You drill holes directly into the stone and use iron pins to anchor wooden beams. How do you create windows in a mountain face? You carefully calculate angles to maximize light while maintaining defensive advantages, then spend months painstakingly carving the opening by hand. The psychological challenge was perhaps more daunting than the physical work. Imagine spending months alone in a dark cave, chipping away at stone walls by flickering torchlight, with no guarantee that your efforts would ever amount to anything. Many attempted mountain castle builders simply gave up, leaving behind partially carved chambers as monuments to abandoned dreams. But those who persisted developed an almost Zen-like relationship with stone and time. They learned to measure progress in seasons rather than days. A good month might see a single room expanded by a few feet in each direction. A successful year might add one complete chamber to the complex. The work demanded a perspective on time that modern people find almost impossible to comprehend. The financial model was equally unique. Traditional castle builders required massive upfront investment. Mountain castle builders started with nothing and built equity literally one chip of stone at a time. Their fortresses grew organically, expanding only as income allowed. This meant they could adapt to changing circumstances, adding defensive features if threatened, or expanding commercial spaces if trade increased. Many mountain castles began as simple shelters but evolved into complex commercial enterprises. The builders would start by securing their basic defensive position, then gradually add amenities that attracted travelers and merchants. A simple sleeping chamber might become an inn. A storage cave could transform into a warehouse for valuable goods. Some mountain castles eventually included workshops, stables, and even small chapels carved directly into the living rock. The defensive advantages were extraordinary. Traditional castles, no matter how well built, could be besieged, undermined, or attacked with siege engines. Mountain castles were virtually immune to conventional medieval warfare. The approaches were too narrow for siege equipment. The walls were literally the mountain itself, impossible to breach or undermine. Many mountain fortresses could be held indefinitely by a handful of defenders against much larger attacking forces. This defensive superiority came with trade-offs. Mountain castles were difficult to supply during extended sieges. They couldn't house large garrisons or accommodate the social functions expected of traditional noble residences. But for men starting with nothing, these limitations were acceptable compromises in exchange for virtually impregnable security. The most successful mountain castle builders understood that their unique position required unique economic strategies. They couldn't compete with traditional lords in terms of agricultural production or conventional military power. Instead, they specialized in services that took advantage of their unusual circumstances. Secure storage, difficult passage control, and specialized mountain warfare became their core competencies. Some mountain castles controlled access to valuable resources like salt deposits, iron ore, or strategic mountain passes. Others served as neutral meeting grounds for enemies who needed secure locations for sensitive negotiations. A few became centers for specialized crafts that required secure, isolated workshops, particularly metalworking and early experimental alchemy. The ingenuity required was staggering. How do you create a stable foundation when carving downward into unknown stone? How do you prevent cave-ins when excavating large chambers? How do you maintain structural integrity while maximizing usable space? These builders became master engineers through pure necessity, developing techniques that wouldn't be formally understood for centuries. The engineering challenges these mountain men faced would have defeated most trained architects of their era. Consider the problem of ventilation in deep rock chambers. Without proper air circulation, workers would suffocate from their own torch smoke, not to mention the deadly gases that could accumulate in sealed stone chambers. These builders developed ingenious solutions, creating networks of narrow air shafts that followed natural rock fissures, sometimes extending hundreds of feet through solid stone to reach the surface. They learned to read the mountain's breath, understanding how air moved through stone corridors during different seasons and weather conditions. Some chambers were carved with subtle slopes and curves that encouraged airflow, creating natural ventilation systems that kept the deepest rooms surprisingly fresh. The most skilled builders could create cross-drafts that would extinguish candles in one chamber, while keeping torches burning steadily in another. Temperature control presented another fascinating challenge. Deep mountain chambers maintained relatively stable temperatures year-round, but the stone walls would weep with condensation during certain weather patterns. Builders learned to carve subtle drainage channels along the floors and walls, directing moisture away from living areas and storage chambers. Some developed techniques for creating insulating air gaps between carved stone walls and wooden interior surfaces. The acoustic properties of these mountain fortresses were equally remarkable. Sound traveled in unexpected ways through carved stone corridors. A whisper in one chamber might be clearly audible several rooms away, while shouting in another room would be completely muffled. Experienced builders learned to exploit these acoustic quirks, creating natural communication systems throughout their fortresses and designing chambers where private conversations could be held without fear of eavesdropping. Lighting solutions required constant innovation. Torches consumed precious fuel and created dangerous smoke in enclosed spaces. Oil lamps were expensive and required regular supply shipments. The most successful builders became experts at maximizing natural light, carving carefully angled light shafts that could illuminate interior chambers even on cloudy days. Some developed primitive mirror systems using polished metal to redirect sunlight deeper into their mountain complexes. The logistics of removing carved stone presented enormous challenges. Every chip of rock that came out of a mountain chamber had to be hauled through narrow passages and disposed of somewhere it wouldn't reveal the extent of the excavation work. Some builders created elaborate pulley systems to lift debris up vertical shafts. Others carved disposal chutes that dropped waste stone into deep crevasses or underground streams. Many mountain castle builders became inadvertent mining experts, discovering valuable mineral deposits during their excavations. Iron ore, copper, silver, and precious stones were occasionally found in the very walls they were carving for living space. These discoveries could transform a desperate survival project into a profitable mining operation, though they also attracted unwanted attention from local lords who claimed mineral rights. The psychological toll of this isolated work created a unique breed of men, years spent alone in dark chambers, chipping away at unyielding stone, produced individuals with extraordinary patience and focus, but sometimes questionable social skills. When these hermit builders finally emerged to interact with the outside world, they were often viewed as strange, obsessive figures who spoke more comfortably about stone grain and water flow than normal human concerns. Some developed elaborate personal rituals around their work. They would carve small shrines in hidden alcoves, leave offerings to patron saints of stoneworkers, or create intricate decorative patterns in chambers that no one else would ever see. These personal touches suggest that the work became deeply spiritual for many builders, a form of meditation through physical labor that connected them to something larger than themselves. The tools evolved through necessity and experimentation. Standard iron pickaxes wore out quickly against hard stone, so builders learned to forge specialized tools for different rock types. They developed techniques for hardening iron points using controlled heating and cooling cycles. Some created composite tools with iron cutting edges fitted to wooden handles, designed for maximum leverage in cramped spaces. Rope technology became crucial for moving heavy stones and accessing difficult work areas. Builders learned to splice different types of rope for specific applications, using hemp for general hauling, leather for applications requiring flexibility, and twisted sinew for delicate work. They developed sophisticated knot systems and pulley arrangements that allowed single workers to move stones that would normally require teams of laborers. Water-powered tools began appearing in some mountain castle projects by the late 12th century. Builders would redirect mountain streams through their work areas, using the flowing water to power primitive hammers and grinding wheels. These early automated systems allowed much faster progress, but required sophisticated engineering to prevent flooding and maintain consistent water pressure. The defensive innovations that emerged from mountain castle building influenced fortress design across Europe. Traditional castle builders began incorporating lessons learned from these underground fortresses. The use of multiple levels, hidden passages, and chambers carved directly into bedrock became increasingly common in conventional castle construction. Some mountain castle builders developed signature techniques that became legendary among their peers. There was the spiral chamber method, where rooms were carved in ascending spirals that created natural defensive choke points while maximizing usable space. The honeycomb approach involved carving multiple small chambers connected by narrow passages, creating maze-like complexes that confused attackers while providing multiple escape routes for defenders. The most ambitious builders attempted to create entire underground cities. These projects often took multiple generations to complete, with sons continuing work their fathers had begun. Some of these generational projects resulted in sprawling complexes with hundreds of chambers, underground chapels, workshops, stables, and even gardens carved from living rock and illuminated by ingenious lightshaft systems. Storage solutions in mountain castles required extraordinary creativity. Traditional castles used wooden granaries and stone cellars, but mountain builders had to carve their storage directly from rock. They learned to create chambers with specific humidity and temperature characteristics for different types of goods. Wine storage areas were carved deep and cool. Grain storage required chambers with excellent air circulation to prevent spoilage. Weapon storage needed dry areas with easy access but defensible positions. The seasonal rhythms of mountain castle building created unique work patterns. Winter months, when temperatures made stone brittle and dangerous to work, were often spent on interior finishing, tool maintenance, and planning future expansions. Spring brought the dangerous season of snowmelt and unpredictable water flow through rock fissures. Summer provided optimal working conditions, but also increased the risk of discovery by passing travelers or hostile forces. Supply chains for mountain castle builders operated on completely different principles than traditional construction projects. Everything had to be carried up treacherous mountain paths or hauled through narrow cave entrances. This limitation forced builders to become remarkably resourceful, learning to create tools, furniture, and even weapons from materials found locally or salvaged from abandoned sites. The social isolation produced fascinating cultural developments within mountain castle communities. Builders who worked with small crews developed their own dialects, incorporating technical terms for different types of stonework, water management techniques, and defensive strategies. These specialized vocabularies allowed experienced mountain builders to communicate complex ideas quickly and precisely. Food production in mountain environments required constant adaptation. Traditional agriculture was impossible on steep rocky slopes, so builders became experts at foraging, hunting small game, and creating ingenious methods for preserving food through long winters. Some developed techniques for growing mushrooms in carved chambers, creating renewable food sources that didn't depend on external supply lines. The legal status of mountain castles existed in a complex grey area of medieval law. Since they were often built on land that no one else wanted or could effectively control, traditional property rights became murky. Some builders operated for decades without any formal claim to their territory, relying on the practical difficulty of dislodging them from their stone fortresses. Religious life in mountain castles took on unique characteristics. Many builders carved small chapels or prayer chambers as integral parts of their fortresses. These sacred spaces often became the most elaborately decorated areas, with intricate stone carvings and carefully designed acoustic properties that enhanced prayer and meditation. Some mountain castles became unofficial pilgrimage sites, attracting visitors who came to see the remarkable fusion of human determination and divine inspiration carved directly into God's creation. The economic networks that developed around mountain castles created entirely new forms of medieval commerce. Unlike traditional feudal economies based on agricultural surplus and land ownership, mountain castle builders operated in what we might recognize today as service economies. They sold security, access, and specialized knowledge rather than physical goods. Some builders developed elaborate intelligence networks, becoming the medieval equivalent of information brokers. Their isolated positions and control over strategic routes meant they often knew about troop movements, political developments, and trade disruptions before anyone else. This information became a valuable commodity, sold to merchants, rival lords, and anyone else willing to pay for advance warning of changing circumstances. The reputation system among mountain castle builders was fascinating and completely informal. Word spread through mountain communities about which builders were trustworthy, which ones had developed innovative techniques, and which projects had failed catastrophically. A builder's reputation could determine whether merchants would trust him with valuable cargo, or whether other builders would share technical knowledge during the rare occasions when they met. Marriage and family life in mountain castles presented unique challenges. Finding spouses willing to live in carved stone chambers, accessed by rope ladders, was difficult enough. Raising children in environments where a wrong step could mean a fatal fall required constant vigilance. Yet some mountain castle families thrived for generations, developing hereditary knowledge about stoneworking and mountain survival that couldn't be learned anywhere else. Women in mountain castle families often became integral to the construction process. While they rarely did the heavy stone carving, they frequently managed the complex logistics of supply gathering, tool maintenance, and food preservation. Some became expert climbers and rope workers, essential skills for accessing remote work sites and hauling materials up cliff faces. The medical knowledge that developed in mountain communities was equally specialized. Traditional medieval medicine assumed access to herb gardens, trained physicians, and standard treatments. Mountain dwellers learned to treat injuries using materials found in cave environments. They became experts at treating cuts from stone chips, broken bones from falls, and respiratory problems from stone dust and poor ventilation. Some mountain castle builders developed primitive first aid techniques that were remarkably advanced for their time. They learned to set broken bones using stone splints, treat infected wounds with mineral-rich cave water, and create herbal remedies from high-altitude plants that grew in rocky crevices. These medical innovations sometimes spread to conventional medieval communities, when mountain dwellers traded their knowledge for supplies. The psychological effects of mountain castle life extended beyond the builders themselves. Visitors often reported feeling overwhelmed by the experience of staying in chambers carved from living rock. The constant awareness of tons of stone overhead, the unusual acoustic properties, and the complete separation from natural light cycles affected people in ways that weren't fully understood at the time. Some guests described profound spiritual experiences while staying in mountain castles. The combination of isolation, unusual architecture, and the obvious evidence of human determination carved into stone created environments that many found deeply moving. Several mountain castles became informal retreat centers where people came to contemplate life changes or seek spiritual guidance. The architectural innovations that emerged from mountain castle construction began influencing above-ground building techniques by the 13th century. Stone masons who had worked on mountain projects brought specialized knowledge about carving, structural engineering, and water management to conventional construction sites. Some of the most impressive Gothic cathedrals incorporated techniques first developed by mountain castle builders. The evolution of heating systems in mountain castles was driven by pure necessity. Traditional fireplaces were dangerous in stone chambers with limited ventilation, and wood was often scarce at high altitudes. Builders developed ingenious solutions using thermal mass, radiant heating through stone walls, and carefully designed air circulation systems that could warm entire complexes using minimal fuel. Some builders created elaborate hypocaust systems, adapting Roman heating techniques to their unique circumstances. These systems used networks of channels carved through stone walls to distribute heated air throughout the complex. The most sophisticated installations could maintain comfortable temperatures in multiple chambers using a single central fire source. Tool innovation continued throughout the mountain castle building era. Builders developed specialized hammers with different head shapes for various types of stonework. They created measuring devices adapted to the irregular surfaces of natural rock. Some invented early forms of surveying equipment to ensure that chambers carved from different directions would connect properly. The preservation techniques used by mountain castle builders were remarkably effective. Many complexes carved in the 12th and 13th centuries remained structurally sound for centuries afterward. The builders' understanding of stone behavior, water management, and structural engineering created fortresses that outlasted many conventional castles built with larger crews and more resources. Weather prediction became a crucial skill for mountain castle builders. They learned to read cloud patterns, wind directions, and atmospheric pressure changes that warned of storms that could flood their excavations or make outdoor work impossibly dangerous. Some developed elaborate folklore about weather signs specific to high-altitude environments. The seasonal merchants, pilgrims, and travelers. Some mountain castles created unique economic opportunities. Migration patterns that developed around often planned their journeys to coincide with favorable weather and the availability of secure mountain lodging. This created predictable income streams that allowed builders to invest in more ambitious expansion projects. Communication systems between mountain castles began developing by the late 12th century. Builders created networks of signal fires, mirror flashes, and horn calls that could relay messages across mountain ranges faster than conventional messengers. These communication networks sometimes became valuable services that builders could sell to political and military leaders. The apprenticeship systems that emerged around successful mountain castle builders were informal but highly effective. Young men who showed aptitude for stonework and mountain survival could spend years learning specialized techniques. These apprenticeships created the closest thing to formal education available in mountain building techniques. The legacy of mountain castle builders extended far beyond their immediate constructions. Their innovations in stoneworking influenced quarrying techniques. Their water management systems informed early hydraulic engineering, and their defensive strategies shaped military architecture throughout the medieval period. Most importantly, they proved that individual determination and technical innovation could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The psychological profile of successful mountain castle builders reveals fascinating insights about human motivation and perseverance. These were men who chose decades of solitary labor over conventional paths to security and status. Their willingness to trade immediate comfort for long-term independence created a unique subculture within medieval society. Many mountain castle builders seemed driven by a desire for complete self-sufficiency that bordered on obsession. They wanted to create spaces where they could survive indefinitely without depending on anyone else. This drive for independence often came at enormous personal cost, but resulted in some of the most impressive individual achievements in medieval construction. The documentation of mountain castle building techniques was largely oral, passed down through direct apprenticeship and rare encounters between builders. Unlike conventional architecture, which was often recorded in monastery libraries and guild records, mountain castle knowledge remained largely hidden. This secrecy was both protective and limiting, preserving techniques from exploitation while preventing wider dissemination of innovations. Some mountain castle builders developed personal philosophies around their work that approached mysticism. They saw their stone carving as a form of dialogue with the mountain itself, reading the stone's natural tendencies and working with rather than against the rock's inherent characteristics. These philosophical approaches sometimes produced more effective building techniques than purely mechanical methods. The decline of mountain castle building came gradually, driven by changes in military technology, political organization, and economic systems. Gunpowder weapons made even the most impregnable stone fortresses vulnerable. Centralized monarchies reduced the opportunities for independent fortress builders. Improved transportation networks made remote mountain locations less strategically valuable. Yet the legacy of these remarkable men persisted in countless ways. Their techniques influenced mining operations. Their architectural innovations appeared in churches and civic buildings, and their example of individual determination inspired generations of builders, inventors, and entrepreneurs who faced seemingly impossible challenges with nothing but skill, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The mountain men who carved castles from living stone represented something profound about human nature. They chose to create rather than conquer, to build rather than destroy. In an age dominated by warfare and political maneuvering, they found power through pure construction, security through patient labor, and immortality through works that merged human ambition with the eternal strength of stone. Their stories spread through medieval Europe like whispered legends, inspiring other desperate men to look at impossible cliffs and see potential homes. But success bred imitation, and imitation often led to disaster. For every Bertrand who carved himself a profitable mountain empire, there were dozens of forgotten men whose bones still rest in collapsed chambers, victims of their own ambition and insufficient understanding of stone behavior. The failed attempts tell us as much about the process as the successes. Archaeological evidence from across the Alps reveals partially carved chambers that were abandoned when builders encountered unexpected water flows, unstable rock formations, or simply ran out of resources before completing habitable spaces. These abandoned projects became cautionary tales whispered among mountain communities, reminders that stonework demanded not just courage but genuine expertise. Consider the case of Guillaume le Tailleur, a landless knight who attempted to carve a fortress into the limestone cliffs near modern-day Provence around 1180. Guillaume had observed successful mountain castle operations and believed he understood the principles involved. He selected what appeared to be ideal stone, began excavating with enthusiasm, and made remarkable initial progress. His chambers were larger and more ambitious than most, his carved details more elaborate, his overall design more sophisticated. But Guillaume made a crucial mistake that experienced builders would have avoided. He failed to properly assess the water table in his chosen cliff face. During his first winter, underground springs that had been dormant during the dry season suddenly activated. Water flooded his excavations faster than his drainage channels could handle. The expanding ice cracked his carefully carved walls, and by spring, 2 years of work had been reduced to a dangerous, unstable cave system that couldn't be safely inhabited. The psychological toll of such failures was devastating. Men who had invested years of their lives and their last resources in mountain castle projects faced not just material loss, but complete social isolation. They couldn't return to their former lives, having burned those bridges when they chose the mountain path. They couldn't remain in their failed excavations, which were often genuinely dangerous. Many simply vanished into the mountains, becoming the hermits and wild men of medieval folklore. Yet failure also drove innovation. Builders who survived catastrophic setbacks often became the most skilled practitioners, having learned through bitter experience what worked and what didn't. They developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for testing stone stability, predicting water behavior, and creating fail-safe systems that could prevent total loss if problems emerged. The tool-making industry that grew around mountain castle building became remarkably specialized. Blacksmiths in mountain communities learned to forge implements specifically designed for stonework in confined spaces. They created picks with reinforced heads that could withstand repeated impacts against hard rock. They developed specialized chisels for different types of carving work, from rough excavation to fine for their ability to create tools perfectly detail work. Some smiths became legendary, suited to specific stone types. A chisel designed for limestone work was useless against granite, and vice versa. The most successful mountain castle builders often traveled considerable distances to obtain tools from smiths who understood their particular geological challenges. The development of lifting and moving equipment was equally crucial. Traditional construction used teams of workers to move heavy stones, but mountain castle builders working alone or with tiny crews needed mechanical solutions. They created elaborate pulley systems using principles that wouldn't be formally codified in engineering texts for centuries. These lifting systems often became architectural features themselves. Permanent winch installations carved directly into stone walls allowed builders to move materials between levels of their complexes. Some developed counterweight systems that could lift heavy stones using the controlled descent of water-filled containers or rock-filled baskets. The rope and cable technology that emerged from mountain castle construction was remarkably advanced. Builders learned to splice different materials for specific applications, creating cables that combined the strength of hemp with the durability of leather and the flexibility of sinew. They developed specialized knots and anchoring systems that could secure loads in situations where traditional methods would fail. Water management became increasingly sophisticated as builders gained experience. Early mountain castle builders often struggled with flooding, condensation, and inadequate drainage. Later practitioners developed comprehensive water management systems that not only kept their excavations dry, but actually used water as a resource for cleaning, cooling, and even primitive sanitation. Some builders created elaborate cistern systems that collected and stored rainwater and snowmelt. These underground reservoirs were carved with carefully calculated capacities and equipped with overflow systems that prevented flooding during heavy precipitation. The most sophisticated installations included filtration systems that used layers of sand and charcoal to purify collected water. The ventilation systems developed by mountain castle builders were equally impressive. They learned to create air circulation patterns that could clear smoke from cooking fires, remove dangerous gases that sometimes seeped from deep rock fissures, and maintain breathable air in chambers that might be hundreds of feet underground. These air circulation, using the natural heating and cooling of stone masses. Builders learned to create temperature differences that drove ventilation systems, often used principles of thermal dynamics that weren't formally understood until much later periods their complexes. The acoustic to create predictable airflows throughout engineering that emerged from mountain castle construction was largely accidental, but often remarkably effective. Builders discovered that certain chamber shapes and passage configurations created acoustic effects that could be used for communication, defense, or simply for the pleasure of improved sound quality during music or conversation. Some chambers were carved with acoustic properties that amplified whispered conversations, allowing private discussions to be heard clearly by participants while remaining inaudible to potential eavesdroppers. Other chambers were designed to muffle sound completely, creating spaces where sensitive meetings could be held without fear of detection. The defensive applications of acoustic engineering were particularly clever. Some builders created chambers where the sound of approaching footsteps would be amplified and transmitted to other parts of the complex, providing early warning of intruders. Others designed passages where voices would echo and distort, confusing attackers about the number and location of defenders. The lighting solutions developed by mountain castle builders pushed the boundaries of medieval technology. Traditional methods using torches and oil lamps were inadequate for complex underground environments. Builders experimented with mirror systems, light wells, and even primitive lens arrangements to maximize the use of available natural light. Some builders created elaborate light during overcast conditions. These shafts used carefully shafted systems that could illuminate interior chambers, even calculated angles and polished metal reflectors, to direct and concentrate natural light. The most sophisticated installations could provide adequate lighting for detailed work throughout most daylight hours. Artificial lighting systems also evolved considerably. Builders learned to create lamp designs that burned more efficiently in low-oxygen environments. They developed wick materials and fuel mixtures that produced more light with less smoke. Some experimented with early forms of candle making, using local materials like animal fats and plant waxes. The heating systems that evolved in mountain castles were driven by the unique challenges of warming stone chambers with limited fuel supplies. Traditional fireplaces were often inadequate or dangerous in enclosed stone spaces. Builders developed increasingly sophisticated solutions that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel consumption and safety risks. Radiant heating systems that used heated stone masses became particularly popular. Builders would create chambers where fires could heat large stone surfaces during the day, then use the thermal mass of the heated stone to warm living spaces throughout the night. These systems required careful engineering to prevent dangerous overheating while ensuring adequate warmth distribution. Some builders developed primitive central heating systems that distributed heated air through networks of carved channels. These systems used single fire sources to warm multiple chambers, dramatically improving fuel efficiency while providing more consistent temperature control throughout the complex. The food production and preservation techniques developed in mountain castle communities were necessarily innovative. Traditional medieval agriculture was impossible in most mountain environments, forcing builders to develop alternative approaches to food security. Foraging became a highly developed skill among mountain castle dwellers. They learned to identify and utilize food sources that lowland peoples ignored or didn't recognize. Fungi and small game provided nutrition sources that were reliable, high-altitude plants, and renewable when properly managed. Food preservation techniques adapted to mountain conditions often proved superior to lowland methods. The naturally cool, dry conditions found in many mountain caves provided excellent environments for smoking meats, aging cheeses, and storing grains. Some builders developed preservation methods that kept food edible for months or even years. The social structures that developed within mountain castle communities were fascinatingly different from conventional medieval hierarchies. Traditional feudal relationships based on land ownership and agricultural production had little relevance in environments where survival depended on specialized technical skills and mutual cooperation. Leadership in mountain castle communities typically emerged organically based on expertise and proven competence rather than inherited status or military prowess. The most successful stone carvers often became informal, newer community leaders, teaching techniques to members and coordinating complex projects that required multiple workers. Gender roles in mountain castle communities were often more flexible than in conventional medieval society. The specialized skills required for mountain survival were needed regardless of gender, and the small size of most communities meant that everyone's contributions were essential. Women in mountain castle families often developed technical skills that would have been unusual or forbidden in lowland communities. The trade relationships that mountain castle builders developed with outside communities were complex and often tense. Lowland peoples were frequently suspicious of mountain dwellers, viewing them as potentially dangerous hermits or outlaws. Yet the specialized goods and services that mountain communities could provide were often valuable enough to overcome social prejudices. Mountain castle builders became experts at producing goods that took advantage of their unique environments and skills. High-quality stonework, specialized metalworking using mountain forges, and rare materials gathered from high-altitude environments all became important trade commodities. The knowledge preservation systems developed by mountain castle builders were necessarily different from conventional medieval methods. Traditional knowledge was typically preserved in monastery libraries or guild records, but mountain communities were often illiterate and isolated from formal educational institutions. Oral tradition became the primary method for preserving and transmitting technical knowledge. Master builders developed elaborate teaching methods that used songs, stories, and ritual practices to encode complex technical information in memorable forms. These oral traditions often included safeguards against the loss of crucial knowledge if individual community members died or left. Some mountain castle builders developed primitive written records using simplified notation systems carved directly into stone walls. These records typically focused on practical information like water levels, seasonal patterns, and construction techniques rather than formal documentation. The religious and spiritual practices that developed in mountain castle communities often blended conventional Christianity with older traditions adapted to mountain environments. The isolation and unique challenges of mountain life created spiritual needs that weren't always addressed by standard religious practices. Many mountain castle builders carved elaborate chapels or prayer spaces as integral parts of their complexes. These sacred spaces often became the most artistically developed areas, featuring intricate stone carvings and carefully designed acoustic properties that enhanced prayer and meditation. The relationship between mountain castle builders and the natural environment around them was complex and often deeply spiritual. Years spent carving living rock created intimate connections with stone, water, and mountain ecosystems that influenced builders' worldviews in profound ways. Some builders developed philosophical approaches to their work that bordered on mysticism. They spoke of listening to the stone, understanding the mountain's desires, and working in harmony with natural forces rather than against them. These approaches often produce more effective building techniques than purely mechanical methods. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life created unique cultural patterns within castle communities. Long winters spent in relative isolation led to the development of elaborate storytelling traditions, craft projects, and social rituals that helped maintain community cohesion during difficult periods. The medical and health practices that evolved in mountain castle communities were adapted to the specific challenges of high-altitude life and stonework environments. Traditional medieval medicine assumed access to specific herbs, trained physicians, and standard treatments that were often unavailable in mountain locations. Mountain castle dwellers became experts at treating injuries and illnesses using locally available materials and improvised techniques. They developed specialized knowledge about treating cuts from stone chips, respiratory problems from stone dust, and injuries from falls in rocky terrain. The integration of mountain castle building techniques into mainstream medieval architecture happened gradually, but had lasting influence. Stone masons who had worked on mountain projects brought specialized knowledge to conventional construction sites, influencing the development of Gothic architecture and advanced stoneworking techniques. The legacy of mountain castle builders extended far beyond their immediate constructions. Their innovations in engineering, their approaches to problem solving, and their demonstrations of what individual determination could accomplish influenced medieval culture in ways that are still visible today in the castles, cathedrals, and fortifications that dot the European landscape. The economic networks that developed around successful mountain castle builders were unlike anything seen in conventional feudal society. While traditional lords extracted wealth from agricultural surplus and land rents, mountain castle builders created entirely new forms of medieval commerce based on services, security, and specialized knowledge. They operated what we might recognize today as the first consulting businesses, selling expertise rather than physical goods. Consider the case of Henri Le Rochier, who by 1190 had established a thriving mountain fortress in what is now eastern France. Henri's castle generated income through 7 different revenue streams, each adapted to his unique circumstances. He charged tolls for passage through the mountain pass his castle controlled. He offered secure storage for valuable goods that merchants didn't want to carry through bandit-infested lowlands. He provided armed escort services through treacherous terrain. He sold specialized climbing equipment and mountain gear to other travelers. He offered accommodation and meals to merchants and pilgrims. He served as a neutral mediator for disputes between rival trading groups. And perhaps most lucratively, he sold information about weather conditions, route safety, and political developments to anyone willing to pay. This diversified approach to income generation was typical of successful mountain castle builders. Unlike conventional lords who depended primarily on agricultural productivity, mountain builders had to be entrepreneurial, constantly identifying new opportunities and adapting to changing circumstances. They couldn't rely on tradition or established practices. Every problem required creative solutions, and every solution potentially represented a new source of income. The reputation networks that developed among mountain castle builders were informal but remarkably effective. Word spread through mountain communities about which builders could be trusted, which ones had developed innovative techniques, and which projects had failed catastrophically. A builder's reputation could determine whether merchants would trust him with valuable cargo, whether other builders would share technical knowledge, or whether potential clients would risk hiring his services. These reputation systems operated entirely through word of mouth and personal recommendation. There were no formal guilds or regulatory bodies to enforce standards or resolve disputes. Trust was earned through demonstrated competence and reliability over years or decades of successful operations. A single major failure or betrayal could destroy a reputation that had taken a lifetime to build. The apprenticeship arrangements that emerged around successful mountain castle builders were equally informal but highly effective. Young men who show learning specialized techniques through direct observation and hands-on practice. These aptitude for stonework and mountain survival could attach themselves to experienced builders. Relationships were typically based on mutual benefit rather than formal contracts. Apprentices provided additional labor for ambitious projects while learning skills that couldn't be acquired anywhere else. Master builders gained helpers who could handle routine tasks while they focused on the most challenging technical work. The arrangement typically lasted several years, with apprentices gradually taking on more responsibility as their skills developed. The knowledge transfer process was entirely oral and experiential. Master builders developed elaborate teaching methods that used stories, demonstrations, and practical exercises to convey complex technical information. They had to be careful about what they revealed and when, balancing the need to train effective helpers against the risk of creating future competitors. Some apprentices eventually struck out on their own to establish new mountain castle projects, Others remained with their masters for decades, becoming trusted partners in increasingly ambitious construction projects. A few developed such specialized skills that they became traveling consultants, offering their expertise to multiple building projects across different mountain ranges. The tool-making traditions that grew around mountain castle construction became increasingly sophisticated over time. Local blacksmiths learned to forge implements specifically designed for stonework in confined spaces. They developed specialized techniques for creating tools that could withstand repeated impacts against hard rock while maintaining sharp cutting edges. Different types of stone required different tool approaches. Limestone could be worked with relatively soft steel tools that could be resharpened easily. Granite demanded much harder cutting edges that held their sharpness longer but were more difficult to maintain. Sandstone required tools with specific edge angles that could cut cleanly without causing unwanted fractures. The most successful mountain castle builders often maintained close relationships with skilled blacksmiths who understood their specific needs. Some builders learned basic metalworking skills themselves, allowing them to maintain and modify their tools without depending on outside services. This self-sufficiency was crucial in remote locations where professional blacksmiths might be days or weeks away. The evolution of lifting and moving equipment continued throughout the mountain castle building era. Traditional construction relied on large teams of workers to move heavy materials, but mountain builders working with minimal crews needed mechanical solutions. They developed increasingly sophisticated pulley systems, winches, and counterweight mechanisms that allowed small groups to accomplish tasks that would normally require dozens of laborers. These mechanical systems often became permanent installations within mountain castle complexes. Builders would carve elaborate winch housings directly into stone walls, creating lifting systems that could be used repeatedly for construction, maintenance, and daily operations. Some developed counterweight systems that used water-filled containers or stone-filled baskets to provide the mechanical advantage needed for heavy lifting. The rope and cable technology that emerged from these applications was remarkably advanced. Builders learned to splice different materials to create cables optimized for specific uses. Hemp provided strength and durability for general applications. Leather offered flexibility for systems that required frequent movement. Sinew provided elasticity for shock-absorbing applications. The most sophisticated installations used cables that combined multiple materials to achieve performance characteristics that wouldn't be matched by mass-produced rope for centuries. Water management systems in mountain castles became increasingly elaborate as builders gained experience with the challenges of controlling water flow in carved stone environments. Early builders often struggled with flooding, inadequate drainage, and problems with water quality. Later practitioners developed comprehensive water management approaches that turned these challenges into advantages. Sophisticated builders learned to create water systems that served multiple functions simultaneously. The same channels that drained excess water from living areas could be used to power primitive machinery, provide cooling during hot weather, and supply water for cleaning and cooking. Some systems included elaborate filtration arrangements that used layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth to purify water collected from questionable sources. The most advanced water management systems included storage, distribution, and waste removal components that rivaled anything found in conventional medieval settlements. Underground cisterns carved from solid rock could store thousands of gallons of water with minimal evaporation loss. Distribution systems used gravity flow and carefully calculated pipe sizes to provide adequate water pressure throughout multi-level complexes. Waste removal systems used flowing water to carry sewage away from living areas without creating sanitation problems. Climate control in mountain castle environments required constant innovation and adaptation. The thermal properties of stone created unique heating and cooling challenges that conventional medieval architecture didn't address. Stone walls provided excellent thermal mass that could store and release heat, but they also conducted cold from the surrounding earth and could create uncomfortable humidity levels during certain weather conditions. successful builders learned to work with rather than against these thermal properties. They created heating systems that use the thermal mass of stone walls to store and distribute heat efficiently. During cold periods, fires would be used to heat stone surfaces during the day. Then the stored thermal energy would warm living spaces throughout the night. This approach required much less fuel than continuous heating, while providing more consistent temperatures. Ventilation systems became equally sophisticated. Builders learned to create air circulation patterns that could remove stale air, control humidity, and maintain breathable atmospheres in chambers that might be hundreds of feet underground. These systems often use principles of thermal dynamics that wouldn't be formally understood until much later periods. The food production strategies developed by mountain castle communities were necessarily different from conventional medieval agriculture. Traditional farming was impossible in most mountain environments, forcing builders to develop alternative approaches to food security that emphasized diversity, preservation, and efficient use of limited resources. Foraging became a highly developed skill among mountain castle dwellers. They learned to identify and utilize food sources that lowland peoples ignored or didn't recognize. High-altitude plants, fungi, and small game provided nutrition sources that were renewable when properly managed. Many builders became expert hunters and trappers, developing techniques specifically adapted to mountain terrain and animal behavior. Food preservation methods adapted to mountain conditions often prove superior to lowland techniques. The naturally cool, dry conditions found in many carved stone chambers provided excellent environments for smoking meats, aging cheeses, and storing grains. Some builders developed preservation methods that kept food edible for months or even years, providing security against failed harvests or interrupted supply lines. The social dynamics within mountain castle communities created unique forms of medieval social organization. Traditional feudal hierarchies based on land ownership and inherited status had little relevance in environments where survival depended on specialized technical skills and cooperative effort. Leadership typically emerged organically based on demonstrated competence and proven reliability rather than birth or military prowess. Gender roles in mountain castle communities were often more flexible than in conventional medieval society. The specialized skills required for mountain survival were needed regardless of gender, and the small size of most communities meant that everyone's contributions were essential. Women in mountain castle families often developed technical skills that would have been unusual or forbidden in lowland communities. Children in mountain castle families grew up with unique skill sets that prepared them for lives very different from conventional medieval childhood. They learned to work with stone, rope, and basic engineering principles from early ages. They developed climbing abilities and mountain survival skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Many became the next generation of mountain castle builders, inheriting both the technical knowledge and the social connections that made such enterprises possible. The trade relationships that mountain castle builders maintained with outside communities were complex and often tense. Lowland peoples were frequently suspicious of mountain dwellers, viewing them as potentially dangerous hermits or outlaws. Yet the specialized goods and services that mountain communities could provide were often valuable enough to overcome social prejudices. Mountain castle builders became experts at producing goods that took advantage of their unique environments and skills. High-quality stonework that couldn't be duplicated in lowland workshops commanded premium prices. Specialized metalworking using mountain forges and local ore deposits produced tools and weapons with distinctive characteristics. Rare materials gathered from high-altitude environments, including certain minerals, plants, and animal products, found ready markets among lowland merchants. The trading relationships often involved complex barter arrangements rather than simple monetary transactions. Mountain builders might exchange stonework or escort services for grain, cloth, or manufactured goods that couldn't be produced in mountain environments. These trading relationships required careful negotiation and often involved long-term agreements that provided security for both parties. The knowledge preservation systems developed by mountain castle builders were necessarily different from conventional medieval methods. Traditional knowledge was typically preserved in monastery libraries or guild records, but mountain communities were often illiterate and isolated from formal educational institutions. They developed alternative methods for preserving and transmitting crucial technical information. Oral tradition became the primary vehicle for knowledge preservation. Master builders developed elaborate teaching methods that used songs, stories, and ritual practices to encode complex technical information in memorable forms. These oral traditions often included multiple redundancies and cross-references that protected against the loss of crucial knowledge if individual community members died or left. Some mountain castle builders developed primitive written records using simplified notation systems carved directly into stone walls. These records typically focused on practical information like seasonal water level patterns, structural load calculations, and maintenance schedules rather than formal documentation. The permanence of stone carving made these records durable, but their fixed location limited their usefulness for sharing information between different communities. The religious and spiritual practices that developed in mountain castle communities often blended conventional Christianity with older traditions adapted to mountain environments. The isolation and unique challenges of mountain life created spiritual needs that weren't always addressed by standard religious observances. Many mountain castle builders carved elaborate chapels or prayer spaces as integral parts of their complexes. These sacred spaces often became the most artistically developed areas of their fortresses, featuring intricate stone carvings and carefully designed acoustic properties that enhanced prayer and meditation. Some chapels were positioned to catch the first light of dawn or the last light of sunset, creating dramatic lighting effects that added to their spiritual impact. The relationship between mountain castle builders and the natural environment around them was complex and often deeply spiritual. Years spent carving living rock created intimate connections with stone, water, and mountain ecosystems that influenced builders' worldviews in profound ways. Many developed what could only be described as mystical relationships with their work, speaking of listening to the stone and understanding the mountain's desires. These spiritual approaches often produced more effective building techniques than purely mechanical methods. Builders who worked in harmony with natural forces rather than fighting against them typically achieved better results with less effort. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated where stone wanted to break, how water preferred to flow, and which structural approaches would work with rather than against natural stresses. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life created unique cultural patterns within castle communities. Long winters spent in relative isolation led to the development of elaborate storytelling traditions, craft projects, and social rituals that helped maintain community cohesion during difficult periods. These winter activities often served practical purposes as well, with storytelling sessions used to review and reinforce technical knowledge, and craft projects focused on creating tools and equipment needed for the following construction season. The medical and health practices that evolved in mountain castle communities were adapted to the specific challenges of high-altitude life and stonework environments. Traditional medieval medicine assumed access to specific herbs, trained physicians, and standard treatments that were often unavailable in mountain locations. Mountain castle dwellers became experts at treating injuries and illnesses using locally available materials and improvised techniques. They developed specialized knowledge about treating cuts from stone chips, respiratory problems from stone dust, and injuries from falls in rocky terrain. Some became skilled at setting broken bones, treating infected wounds, and managing the chronic joint problems that often resulted from years of heavy stonework. The integration of mountain castle building techniques into mainstream medieval architecture happened gradually, but had lasting influence. Stonemasons who had worked on mountain projects brought specialized knowledge to conventional construction sites, influencing the development of advanced stone working techniques and architectural innovations that appeared in cathedrals, civic buildings, and conventional fortifications. The legacy of mountain castle builders extended far beyond their immediate constructions. Their innovations in engineering, their approaches to problem solving under extreme constraints, and their demonstrations of what individual determination could accomplish influenced medieval culture in ways that are still visible today. They proved that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through patience, skill, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The decline of mountain castle building came gradually, driven by changes in military technology, political organization, and economic systems that reduced the advantages these isolated fortresses had once provided. Gunpowder weapons made even the most impregnable stone fortresses vulnerable to attack. Centralized monarchies reduced the opportunities for independent fortress builders. Improved transportation networks made remote mountain locations less strategically valuable. Yet the techniques, traditions, and examples set by these remarkable builders persisted in countless ways. Their engineering innovations influenced mining operations and civil construction projects. Their architectural solutions appeared in churches and civic buildings throughout Europe. Their example of individual determination inspired generations of builders, inventors, and entrepreneurs who faced seemingly impossible challenges with nothing but skill, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible when human determination met stone, time, and the eternal patience of mountains. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of mountain castle building was how it attracted not just the desperate, but the obsessed. By the 13th century, stories had spread throughout Europe about these stone hermits who carved palaces from cliff faces. The tales grew in the telling, as tales do, and soon every tavern from London to Naples buzzed with whispers about men who could make mountains bend to their will. These stories drew a particular type of person, not the practical-minded knights looking for quick solutions to landlessness, but genuine fanatics who saw mountain carving as a calling rather than mere survival strategy. They arrived at remote cliff faces with a gleam in their eyes that worried even experienced builders. These weren't men seeking shelter. They were artists whose canvas happened to be several thousand tons of limestone. Take the case of Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk who abandoned his monastery in 1198 to pursue what he called divine architecture. Marcus believed that God spoke most clearly through stone, and that by carving directly into his creation, he could create spaces that literally brought heaven closer to earth. His theological reasoning was questionable, but his dedication was absolute. Marcus selected a nearly vertical cliff face in the Alps that looked utterly impossible even by mountain castle standards. The stone was hard granite, resistant to carving and prone to dangerous fractures. The location was so remote that supply runs required 3 days of climbing through terrain that killed pack animals and left human porters gasping for breath. Most experienced builders took one look at Marcus's chosen site and quietly departed, muttering prayers for his clearly disturbed soul. But Marcus persisted with a determination that bordered on supernatural. He worked 18 hours a day, every day for 7 years. He carved by torchlight when darkness fell. He carved through blizzards that should have frozen him solid. He carved while suffering from altitude sickness, malnutrition, and what contemporary observers described as religious ecstasy that manifested as uncontrollable trembling. The results were extraordinary. Marcus created chambers that seemed to defy the limitations of stone. His great hall featured soaring arches carved directly from living rock that created acoustic effects of haunting beauty. His chapel included stone tracery as delicate as lace, proving that the right combination of skill and obsession could make granite behave like clay. His residential chambers featured details so intricate that visitors swore they could see individual flower petals carved into decorative borders. But Marcus's masterpiece was his library, a circular chamber carved into the very heart of the mountain. The walls curved inward toward a domed ceiling pierced by a single opening that allowed a shaft of sunlight to illuminate the center of the room at precisely noon every day. Stone shelves carved directly from the walls could hold thousands of volumes, though Marcus owned only a handful of religious texts and his own increasingly mystical writings about the spiritual properties of stone. The psychological toll of such intensive, isolated work became evident in Marcus's final years. Visitors reported that he spoke to the stones as if they were old friends, holding lengthy conversations about theological matters with particular rock formations. He claimed that different types of stone had distinct personalities, and that granite was particularly stubborn, but ultimately more honest than limestone, which he considered charming but unreliable. Marcus's story ended tragically, but perhaps inevitably. In 1205, he attempted to carve what he called his stairway to heaven, a spiral staircase that would ascend through the mountain's core to emerge at its peak. The engineering challenges were immense, requiring precise calculations of structural loads and stone behavior that pushed even Marcus's considerable skills beyond their limits. The staircase collapsed while Marcus was working on its upper sections. His body was never recovered, presumably buried under tons of granite that he had spent years lovingly carving. But his fortress remained, a testament to what human obsession could accomplish when freed from practical constraints. Later visitors described it as the most beautiful and most disturbing place they had ever seen, a monument to the thin line between dedication and madness. Marcus's example inspired imitators, most of whom lacked his peculiar combination of technical skill and religious fervour. The mountains of Europe began filling with half-finished chambers carved by men who had underestimated the psychological toll of extended isolation and overestimated their own abilities to read stone behaviour under stress. The failure rate among these second-generation mountain castle builders was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence suggests that for every successful project completed after 1200, at least 5 were abandoned, when builders either died, went mad, or simply walked away from excavations that had consumed years of their lives without producing habitable spaces. The technical challenges that defeated these later builders were often subtle but deadly. Stone that appeared solid and stable during initial excavation might develop stress fractures months or years later, as the removal of surrounding material changed the distribution of geological forces. Water tables shifted unpredictably as climate patterns changed, or as excavation work altered underground drainage patterns. Ventilation systems that worked perfectly during construction might fail catastrophically when chambers were sealed and occupied full-time. Perhaps most dangerous was the tendency for builders to become overconfident as their projects progressed. Success in carving initial chambers often led to increasingly ambitious plans that pushed technical and structural limits beyond safe margins. Builders who had successfully completed modest excavations would attempt soaring vaults, elaborate architectural details, or complex multi-level systems that required expertise they didn't possess. The social isolation also took its toll in unexpected ways. Many builders started their projects with clear, practical goals, but gradually lost perspective as years of solitary work disconnected them from normal human society. They began making decisions based on personal obsessions rather than practical considerations, carving elaborate decorative elements while neglecting essential structural reinforcements or creating beautiful chambers that were functionally useless. Some developed elaborate philosophical justifications for their increasingly impractical choices. They spoke of creating perfect spaces that transcended mundane concerns about comfort or utility. They claimed to be following divine inspiration that revealed itself through the patterns they discovered in stone grain, or the acoustic properties of their chambers. The communities that grew around successful mountain castle builders developed their own unique cultures that often seemed alien to outside observers. Years of shared struggle against stone and mountain weather created bonds between community members that were deeper but also stranger than conventional social relationships. These communities developed their own languages, incorporating technical terms for stonework, weather patterns, and survival techniques that had no equivalents in lowland dialects. They created social customs adapted to the rhythms of mountain life and construction work. They established informal hierarchies based on technical competence rather than traditional markers of status. The gender dynamics in these communities were particularly unusual. The small size of mountain castle communities and the specialized nature of the work meant that traditional gender roles often became impractical. Women learned stoneworking techniques, rope handling, and engineering skills that would have been forbidden in conventional medieval society. Men took on food preparation, textile work, and childcare responsibilities that lowland culture assigned exclusively to women. Children growing up in mountain castle communities developed skill sets that prepared them for lives radically different from conventional medieval childhood. They learned to read stone grain and weather patterns before they learned to read written language. They developed climbing abilities and spatial reasoning skills that seemed almost superhuman to lowland visitors. They grew up understanding engineering principles through daily observation and hands-on experience, rather than formal education. But this isolation also meant that mountain castle children often struggled when they eventually encountered conventional society. Their technical skills were impressive but highly specialized. Their social behaviors had adapted to tiny communities where everyone knew everyone else intimately. Their expectations about gender roles, authority structures, and economic relationships were based on mountain community norms that differed dramatically from lowland practices. The trade relationships between mountain castle communities and conventional medieval society remained complex and often tense throughout the mountain castle building era. Lowland peoples continued to view mountain dwellers with suspicion and unease, while mountain communities developed their own prejudices against what they saw as the softness and corruption of lowland life. These mutual suspicions created persistent problems for mountain castle builders who needed to maintain economic relationships with outside communities. They had to balance their desire for independence and self-sufficiency against their practical need for goods and services that couldn't be produced in mountain environments. Successful mountain castle builders became skilled diplomats as well as engineers, learning to navigate the complex social dynamics that governed their relationships with lowland communities. They developed strategies for presenting themselves as respectable business partners rather than dangerous hermits. They learned to offer services that lowland communities valued enough to overcome their social prejudices. The reputation systems that governed these relationships operated through informal networks that spanned entire regions. Information about trustworthy mountain builders, successful projects, and catastrophic failures spread through merchant networks, pilgrimage routes, and military campaigns. A single betrayal or failure could destroy relationships that had taken decades to establish. The knowledge preservation challenges faced by mountain castle communities became increasingly acute as the building tradition matured. The technical expertise required for successful mountain castle construction was highly specialized and difficult to transmit through conventional medieval educational methods. Master builders developed increasingly sophisticated teaching techniques that combined practical instruction with theoretical knowledge about stone behavior, structural engineering, and water management. They created apprenticeship programs that could transmit complex technical knowledge while also testing students' psychological fitness for the demanding lifestyle of mountain construction work. The most successful knowledge preservation systems combined multiple approaches to ensure that crucial technical information wouldn't be lost if individual community members died or left. Oral traditions provided flexible, memorable methods for transmitting practical knowledge. Carved stone records offered permanent documentation of successful techniques and important observations. Apprenticeship relationships created personal connections that motivated careful knowledge transmission between generations. Some mountain castle communities developed primitive libraries that collected not just technical information, but also philosophical and spiritual writings about the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. These collections often included personal accounts written by builders who had survived major failures, providing cautionary tales that helped future builders avoid repeating dangerous mistakes. The religious and spiritual dimensions of mountain castle building became increasingly important as the tradition matured. Many builders developed deeply personal relationships with their work that transcended practical considerations about shelter and defense. The act of carving living stone became a form of meditation for many builders. The rhythm of hammer-dual transformation of raw rock and chisel, the gra into functional space, and the intimate knowledge of stone behavior that developed over years of work created psychological states that many builders described in spiritual terms. Some builders incorporated formal religious observances into their daily work routines, beginning each day with prayers for guidance and safety, and ending with thanksgiving for progress accomplished. Others developed more personal spiritual practices that drew on pre-Christian traditions about sacred relationships between humans and the natural world. The chapels and prayer spaces that most mountain castle builders carved as parts of their complexes often became the most artistically sophisticated areas of their fortresses. These sacred spaces provided opportunities for builders to express aesthetic ambitions that went far beyond practical functionality. They featured elaborate carved decorations, sophisticated acoustic design, and lighting systems that created dramatic effects during religious observances. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life created natural cycles of work and contemplation that many builders found spiritually meaningful. Long winter periods when outdoor work was impossible provided time for reflection, planning, and spiritual preparation for the following construction season. The return of spring brought renewed energy for physical work, that many builders experienced as spiritual renewal as well as practical opportunity. The legacy of mountain castle building extended far beyond the immediate practical results of individual construction projects. The tradition created a body of technical knowledge, cultural practices, and philosophical approaches that influenced medieval society in ways that are still visible today. The engineering innovations developed by mountain castle builders found applications in conventional construction projects throughout Europe. Techniques for working with difficult stone, managing water in challenging environments, and creating structural solutions under extreme constraints influenced the development of cathedral architecture, civic engineering, and military fortification design. The cultural impact was equally significant. The example of individuals accomplishing seemingly impossible tasks through patience, skill, and determination became part of medieval folklore and influenced attitudes about human potential and the relationship between individual effort and social achievement. The philosophical traditions that emerged from mountain castle building communities contributed to broader medieval discussions about the relationship between human ambition and divine will, the proper use of natural resources, and the spiritual significance of physical labor. Perhaps most importantly, the mountain castle building tradition demonstrated that alternative approaches to medieval social and economic organization were possible. These communities proved that small groups of motivated individuals could create prosperous, secure societies without depending on conventional feudal hierarchies or agricultural surplus. The decline of mountain castle building came gradually, driven by changes in military technology, political organization, and economic systems that reduced the advantages these isolated fortresses had once provided. But the techniques, traditions, and examples set by these remarkable builders continued to influence European culture long after the last mountain castle was carved from living stone. The mountain men who built castles from scratch represented something profound about human nature and potential. They chose to create rather than conquer, to build rather than inherit, to work with stone and time rather than depend on the accidents of birth and political fortune. In an age dominated by warfare and political maneuvering, they found power through construction, security through patient labor, and immortality through works that merged human determination with the eternal endurance of mountains. Their stories spread throughout medieval Europe, inspiring other desperate or ambitious individuals to look at impossible challenges and see opportunities rather than obstacles. They proved that with sufficient skill, patience, and determination, even the most daunting natural barriers could be transformed into foundations for human achievement. The psychological profiles of successful mountain castle builders reveal fascinating insights about human motivation and the relationship between individual ambition and social achievement. These were individuals who chose decades of difficult, dangerous, isolated work over conventional paths to security and status. Their willingness to trade immediate comfort for long-term independence created a unique subculture within medieval society. Many seemed driven by needs that went deeper than simple survival or material advancement. They sought control over their physical environment, independence from social hierarchies they couldn't or wouldn't navigate successfully, and the satisfaction of creating something permanent through their own efforts. These drives often came at enormous personal cost, but resulted in achievements that outlasted the conventional successes of their more socially integrated contemporaries. The mountain castle building tradition ultimately stands as testament to human adaptability and determination. It demonstrates that individuals working with basic tools and unlimited patience could accomplish tasks that seem impossible by modern standards. It proves that alternative approaches to social organization and economic development were possible even within the constraints of medieval European society. Most importantly, it reminds us that the human capacity for achievement is limited more by imagination and determination than by material resources or social circumstances. The mountain men, who carved castles from living stone, showed that with sufficient skill and persistence, even the most challenging natural obstacles could be transformed into foundations for security, prosperity, and lasting accomplishment. Their legacy lives on not just in the remarkable structures they left behind, but in the example they set for future generations facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. They proved that stone yields to patience, that mountains can be moved one chip at a time, and that human determination, properly applied, can literally move the earth. The tools of mountain castle building evolved in ways that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of builders. By the late 12th century, master craftsmen had developed specialized instruments that could read stone like a book. They created measuring devices that could detect stress fractures invisible to the naked eye. They forged chisels with cutting edges designed for specific types of geological formations, each one representing years of experimentation with different alloy compositions and heat treatments. The most remarkable innovation was the development of what builders called stone whisperers. Thin metal probes that could be inserted into hairline cracks to test the stability of surrounding rock. Experienced builders learned to interpret the vibrations transmitted through these probes, feeling the difference between solid stone and areas where internal fractures might cause catastrophic failure months or years later. Sound became another tool. Master builders developed techniques for tapping stone with specialized hammers, listening to the resonance patterns that revealed internal structure. A solid, ringing tone indicated stable rock suitable for major excavation. Dull, muffled sounds warned of hidden voids or unstable formations. The most skilled practitioners could identify different types of stone, predict fracture patterns, and locate underground water sources simply by listening to how their hammers rang against cliff faces. Temperature variations provided yet another source of information. Builders learned that different stones expanded and contracted at predictable rates as daily temperatures changed. They could identify stress concentrations by feeling subtle temperature differences across rock surfaces. Areas where stone felt warmer or cooler than surrounding rock often indicated internal fractures or water infiltration that might cause problems during excavation. The rope technology that emerged from mountain castle construction was equally sophisticated. Builders developed specialized splicing techniques that created cables stronger than their individual components. They learned to combine different materials in precise patterns, using hemp for tensile strength, leather for flexibility, and sinew for elasticity. The most advanced installations used cables that incorporated metal threads for applications requiring extreme durability. Knot systems became incredibly complex. Master builders could tie knots that would hold specific loads, but release automatically when weight exceeded safe limits. They created adjustable fastening systems that could be modified without untying, allowing for precise load adjustments during lifting operations. Some knots were designed to tighten under load, but remain easy to untie once tension was released, solving the persistent problem of removing climbing ropes after they had been stressed by heavy use. The pulley systems developed for mountain castle construction pushed medieval mechanical engineering to its limits. Builders created compound pulley arrangements that provided mechanical advantages of 10 to 1 or greater, allowing single workers to lift stones that would normally require teams of labourers. These systems used precisely calculated sheave diameters and rope routing patterns that minimized friction while maximizing lifting efficiency. Some builders developed early forms of automated lifting systems. They created counterweight mechanisms that could be loaded with stones during the day, then used the gradual release of counterweight force to power lifting operations throughout the night. These systems allowed continuous progress even when builders were sleeping, though they required careful engineering to prevent dangerous malfunctions. Water-powered tools began appearing in mountain castle projects, where flowing streams could be diverted through construction areas. Builders created primitive trip hammers powered by water wheels, allowing mechanical stone breaking that was faster and less exhausting than handwork. They developed water-powered grinding wheels for sharpening tools and polishing carved surfaces. Some installations included water-powered bellows that could maintain forge fires for metalworking without requiring constant human attention. The integration of these mechanical systems into ongoing construction projects required extraordinary coordination and planning. Builders had to design excavation sequences that accommodated the installation and operation of increasingly complex machinery while maintaining safe working conditions in confined spaces. They learned to create modular mechanical systems that could be disassembled and moved as construction progressed through different areas of their mountain complexes. Lighting technology advanced dramatically as builders developed techniques for working in deep chambers where natural light never penetrated. Traditional torches and oil lamps were inadequate for precision stonework in confined spaces. Builders experimented with different fuel mixtures, wick materials, and reflector designs to create lighting systems that provided adequate illumination while minimizing smoke production and fire hazards. Polished metal reflectors became sophisticated optical instruments. Builders learned to shape bronze and silver surfaces that could concentrate and direct light with remarkable precision. They created adjustable reflector systems that could track the movement of natural light throughout the day, maintaining consistent illumination in work areas regardless of changing sun angles. Some builders developed primitive lens systems using clear crystals or carefully shaped pieces of glass. These early optical instruments could concentrate natural light into intense beams suitable for detailed carving work. The most sophisticated installations used networks of mirrors and lenses that could illuminate interior chambers using only natural light sources, eliminating the need for flames in areas where fire presented unacceptable risks. The acoustic engineering that emerged from mountain castle construction was largely accidental, but often remarkably sophisticated. Builders discovered that specific chamber shapes and passage configurations created acoustic effects that could be exploited for communication, defense, or aesthetic purposes. They learned to design spaces where whispered conversations could be heard clearly across considerable distances while remaining inaudible to potential eavesdroppers. Echo patterns became tools for both practical communication and artistic expression. Some chambers were carved with acoustic properties that created complex echo effects, transforming simple spoken words into haunting musical phrases. Others were designed to amplify and clarify speech, creating natural amphitheaters where small groups could hold meetings without straining their voices. The defensive applications of acoustic engineering were particularly ingenious. Builders created chambers where the approach of intruders would be announced by distinctive sound patterns transmitted through carefully designed passages. They developed acoustic warning systems that could alert defenders to threats while remaining nearly inaudible to approaching enemies. Food production in mountain castle communities required constant innovation and adaptation to harsh environmental conditions. Traditional medieval agriculture was impossible in most mountain locations, forcing builders to develop alternative approaches that emphasized efficiency, diversity, and resilience rather than maximum production of single crops. Vertical growing systems became common in mountain communities. Builders carved terraced growing areas into cliff faces, creating microclimates that could support plants that wouldn't survive in the harsh conditions of exposed mountain slopes. These terraced gardens often incorporated sophisticated irrigation systems that collected and distributed water from multiple sources. Underground growing chambers provided protected environments for cultivating food plants that required stable temperatures and protection from mountain weather. Builders learned to create chambers with specific humidity and temperature characteristics suitable for different types of plants. Some underground gardens incorporated primitive greenhouse principles, using reflected sunlight and thermal mass to create growing conditions that extended productive seasons far beyond what natural mountain climate would allow. Mushroom cultivation became a specialty of many mountain communities. Builders discovered that certain chambers provided ideal conditions for growing edible fungi using organic waste materials and carefully controlled moisture levels. These mushroom farms could produce significant quantities of protein-rich food, using resources that would otherwise be wasted. Preservation techniques adapted to mountain conditions often proved superior to lowland methods. The naturally cool, dry conditions found in many carved chambers provided excellent environments for smoking meats, aging cheeses, and storing grains. Builders developed preservation methods that could keep food edible for extended periods, providing security against supply disruptions and seasonal shortages. Some communities developed elaborate food storage systems that used the natural temperature variations in different parts of their mountain complexes. Root vegetables could be stored in cool, humid chambers. Grains required dry, well-ventilated areas. Preserved meats needed consistent, cool temperatures with good air circulation. The most sophisticated storage systems used natural convection patterns to maintain optimal conditions in different storage areas without requiring artificial heating or cooling. The social structures that developed within mountain castle communities were fascinatingly different from conventional medieval hierarchies. Traditional feudal relationships based on land ownership and inherited status had little relevance in environments where survival depended on technical competence and cooperative effort. Leadership roles typically emerged organically based on demonstrated expertise rather than formal authority. The most skilled stoneworkers often became informal community leaders, teaching techniques to newer members and coordinating projects that required multiple workers. But these leadership roles were usually temporary and task-specific, rather than permanent positions of authority. Decision-making processes in mountain communities typically emphasize consensus and practical considerations rather than formal hierarchy. Major decisions about construction priorities, resource allocation, and community policies were usually made through discussion among all adult community members. This participatory approach was necessitated by the small size of most communities, and the reality that everyone's cooperation was essential for survival. Gender roles in mountain castle communities were often more flexible than in conventional medieval society. The specialized skills required for mountain survival were needed regardless of gender, and the small size of most communities meant that rigid role divisions were impractical. Women often developed technical skills in stonework, metalworking, and engineering that would have been unusual or forbidden in lowland communities. Children in mountain communities grew up with responsibilities and skills that prepared them for adult roles very different from conventional medieval childhood. They learned technical skills through observation and gradually increasing participation in construction work. They developed physical abilities and risk assessment skills that seemed extraordinary to outside observers. Many became the next generation of mountain castle builders, inheriting both technical knowledge and social connections that made such enterprises possible. Marriage and family formation in mountain communities followed patterns adapted to the unique constraints and opportunities of mountain life. Traditional medieval marriage arrangements based on property transfers and family alliances had limited relevance in communities where wealth was measured in technical skills and construction achievements, rather than land ownership or agricultural production. Courtship and marriage decisions often emphasize compatibility in work skills and temperament, rather than economic or social status. Successful mountain families required partners who could work together effectively under challenging conditions, while maintaining emotional stability during extended periods of isolation and difficult physical labor. Child rearing in mountain environments required constant attention to safety and gradual skill development. Parents had to balance the need for children to learn essential technical skills against the risks of serious injury in environments where medical care was limited, and evacuation to outside help might be impossible during bad weather. The educational systems that developed in mountain communities were necessarily practical and experiential, rather than formal or theoretical. Children learned through observation, imitation, and gradually increasing participation in adult work. They developed technical skills, environmental awareness, and problem-solving abilities through daily experience, rather than classroom instruction. Some mountain communities developed sophisticated, informal curricula that ensured children learned not just technical skills, but also the cultural knowledge, social values, and historical traditions that maintained community identity. These educational approaches often use storytelling, games, and ritual activities to transmit complex information in memorable and engaging ways. The trade relationships that mountain castle communities maintained with outside groups required careful balance between independence and economic necessity. Mountain builders needed certain goods and services that couldn't be produced locally, but they also had to maintain enough self-sufficiency to survive extended periods when outside contact was impossible due to weather or political conditions. Successful trading relationships often developed around the exchange of specialized goods and services that took advantage of each community's unique capabilities. Mountain communities could provide high-quality stonework, specialized metalworking, and rare materials gathered from high-altitude environments. Outside communities offered manufactured goods, agricultural products, and access to larger markets for mountain-produced items. These trading arrangements typically involved long-term relationships based on mutual trust and benefit, rather than simple monetary transactions. Mountain builders often provided services like secure storage or armed escort in exchange for regular deliveries of essential supplies. Such arrangements provided security for both parties, while accommodating the practical constraints of mountain commerce. The knowledge preservation systems developed by mountain castle builders were necessarily adapted to small, often illiterate communities with limited access to formal educational institutions. Traditional methods for preserving technical knowledge through written records were often impractical, forcing communities to develop alternative approaches that emphasized oral transmission and practical demonstration. Master builders developed elaborate teaching techniques that use songs, stories, and ritual practices to encode complex technical information in forms that could be remembered and transmitted accurately across generations. These oral traditions often included multiple cross-references and verification methods that protected against the corruption or loss of crucial technical knowledge. Some communities developed primitive written records using simplified notation systems carved directly into stone surfaces. These records typically focused on practical information like structural calculations, water management observations, and seasonal weather patterns rather than formal documentation or historical narratives. The most sophisticated knowledge preservation systems combine multiple approaches to ensure that essential technical information would survive even if individual community members died or left. Oral traditions provided flexible methods for transmitting practical knowledge. Stone carvings offered permanent records of successful techniques and important observations. Apprenticeship relationships created personal bonds that motivated careful knowledge transmission between experienced builders and their successors. Religious and spiritual practices in mountain castle communities often blended conventional Christian observances with older traditions adapted to mountain environments and the unique challenges of stonework. The isolation and physical demands of mountain life created spiritual needs that weren't always addressed by standard religious practices available in lowland communities. Many mountain castle builders carved elaborate chapels or prayer spaces as integral parts of their fortress complexes. These sacred areas often became the most artistically sophisticated spaces in their constructions, featuring intricate stone carvings, sophisticated acoustic design, and lighting systems that created dramatic effects during religious observances. The act of carving living stone became a form of spiritual practice for many builders. The patient, repetitive work of shaping rock created meditative states that many described in religious terms. The gradual transformation of raw stone into functional and beautiful spaces provided metaphors for spiritual development that influenced how builders understood their relationship with divine forces. Some communities developed distinctive theological perspectives that emphasized the spiritual significance of physical labor and the sacred nature of creation itself. These theological approaches often drew on biblical traditions about craftsmanship and divine creation, while incorporating practical observations about the behavior of stone, water, and other natural forces encountered in mountain construction work. Seasonal religious observances in mountain communities were often adapted to the rhythms of construction work and mountain weather patterns. Traditional Christian holidays might be celebrated on different dates if weather conditions made normal observance impractical. Some communities developed additional observances that marked important milestones in construction projects or seasonal changes that affected their work. The relationship between mountain castle builders and the natural environment was complex and often deeply spiritual. Years spent working directly with stone, water, and mountain weather created intimate knowledge of natural processes that influenced builders' worldviews in profound ways. Many developed what could only be described as personal relationships with their physical environment. Builders often spoke of listening to stone, understanding water's preferences, and reading the mountain's moods through subtle changes in weather patterns, rock behavior, and seasonal rhythms. These approaches were partly practical, reflecting genuine observations about natural processes that affected construction work, but they also had spiritual dimensions that went beyond purely utilitarian concerns. Some builders developed elaborate philosophical frameworks that explained their work in terms of cooperation with natural forces rather than domination over them. They saw their role as helping stone realize its potential for beauty and function rather than forcing it into predetermined shapes. These philosophical approaches often produced more effective building techniques than purely mechanical methods. The environmental awareness that developed in mountain communities was remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period. Builders learned to read subtle environmental indicators that warned of changing weather patterns, seasonal variations in water flow, and long-term changes in geological stability. This environmental knowledge was essential for survival, but also influenced how community members understood their place in the natural world. Conservation practices emerged naturally from the resource constraints of mountain life. Nothing could be wasted when replacement materials might be impossible to obtain during long winter months or extended periods of isolation. This necessity created conservation habits and resource management techniques that were far ahead of conventional medieval practices. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life created natural cycles of intense work and contemplative rest that many community members found spiritually meaningful. The return of spring brought renewed energy for construction work that was often experienced as spiritual renewal as well as practical opportunity. Long winter periods when outdoor work was impossible provided time for reflection, planning, and community bonding that strengthened social relationships and cultural traditions. The medical and health practices that evolved in mountain castle communities were necessarily adapted to the specific challenges of high-altitude life and physically demanding stonework. Traditional medieval medicine assumed access to specific herbs, trained physicians, and standard treatments that were often unavailable in mountain locations. Mountain castle dwellers became experts at treating injuries and illnesses using locally available materials and improvised techniques. They developed specialized knowledge about treating cuts from stone chips, respiratory problems from stone dust, and injuries from falls in rocky terrain. Some became skilled at setting broken bones, treating infected wounds, and managing chronic joint problems that often resulted from years of heavy physical labor. Preventive health practices became particularly important in communities where serious injuries or illnesses could be life-threatening due to isolation from outside medical help. Mountain dwellers learned to recognize early symptoms of common health problems and develop techniques for preventing injuries through proper work habits and safety precautions. Herbal medicine using high-altitude plants became a specialty of many mountain communities. Builders learned to identify and use medicinal plants that grew in rocky, high-altitude environments. Some of these plants had properties that weren't found in lowland medicinal herbs, leading to the development of distinctive treatment methods that were sometimes more effective than conventional medieval medicine. Mental health considerations became important in communities where extended isolation and demanding physical work created psychological stresses that weren't commonly encountered in lowland society. Mountain communities developed informal but effective methods for recognizing and addressing depression, anxiety, and other psychological problems that could result from their challenging lifestyle. The integration of mountain castle building techniques into mainstream medieval architecture happened gradually but had lasting influence throughout Europe. Stone masons who had worked on mountain projects brought specialized knowledge to conventional construction sites, influencing the development of advanced building techniques that appeared in cathedrals, civic buildings, and military fortifications. Gothic architecture in particular benefited from innovations developed by mountain castle builders. Techniques for working with difficult stone, creating structural solutions under extreme constraints, and managing complex engineering challenges influenced the soaring vaults, flying buttresses, and intricate stone tracery that characterized the greatest medieval cathedrals. Military architecture also incorporated lessons learned from mountain castle construction. The use of natural defensive advantages, hidden passages, and chambers carved directly into bedrock became increasingly common in conventional fortress design. Many later medieval castles included features that were directly inspired by mountain castle innovations. Urban planning and civil engineering projects adopted water management techniques, structural engineering principles, and construction methods that had been pioneered in mountain environments. These innovations improved the quality and durability of medieval infrastructure while reducing construction costs and time requirements. The legacy of mountain castle builders extended far beyond their immediate architectural achievements. Their innovations in engineering, their approaches to problem solving under extreme constraints, and their demonstrations of individual determination influenced medieval culture in ways that are still visible in European architecture, engineering, and cultural traditions. They proved that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through patience, skill, and persistence. They demonstrated that alternative approaches to social organization and economic development were possible even within the constraints of medieval European society. Most importantly, they showed that human creativity and determination could transform the most challenging natural obstacles into foundations for security, prosperity, and lasting achievement. Their example inspired generations of builders, inventors, and entrepreneurs who faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. The mountain men who carved castles from living stone proved that with sufficient skill and determination, Even the most daunting natural barriers could be transformed into testaments to human ingenuity and the enduring power of individual vision made manifest in stone. Their influence rippled through medieval society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Master masons who had learned their craft in mountain caves brought revolutionary techniques to cathedral construction sites across Europe. They understood how to read stone like a living document, interpreting stress patterns and structural weaknesses that conventional builders missed entirely. The soaring vaults of Notre Dame, the impossible arches of Canterbury Cathedral, the delicate tracery of Sainte-Chapelle, all bear the invisible fingerprints of men who had first learned to carve by torchlight in granite chambers hundreds of feet underground. The philosophical impact was equally profound. These builders had proven that individual will, properly applied, could literally move mountains. Their example challenged the rigid social hierarchies of medieval Europe, suggesting that birth and bloodline mattered less than skill and determination. A landless peasant with a pickaxe and 20 years of patience could create something more enduring than the grandest noble palace built with inherited wealth and conscripted labour. The knowledge networks that developed around mountain castle building created some of medieval Europe's first technical consulting businesses. Master builders who had successfully completed mountain projects found themselves in demand across the continent, travelling from site to solve construction problems that baffled conventional architects. They commanded fees that rivaled those of the most successful merchants. Their expertise valued precisely because it couldn't be bought or inherited, only earned through years of dangerous, solitary labour. These travelling masters created informal guilds that shared technical knowledge across political boundaries. A technique developed in the alpine caves of Switzerland might find its way to Scottish cliff faces through networks of builders who recognised each other by subtle marks carved into their work. They developed their own languages of stone, systems of notation that could encode complex structural information in simple symbols carved into hidden corners of their constructions. The economic models they pioneered influenced commercial development throughout medieval Europe. Their emphasis on service-based income rather than agricultural production provided alternatives to feudal economic structures. Mountain castle builders proved that wealth could be created through knowledge and skill rather than land ownership and inherited privilege. This example inspired craftsmen, merchants, and early entrepreneurs who sought independence from traditional feudal obligations. Women in mountain castle communities developed roles and responsibilities that were unprecedented in medieval European society. The practical demands of mountain construction meant that gender restrictions common in lowland communities became luxury these isolated builders couldn't afford. Women learned engineering principles, managed complex logistics, and often served as crucial links between mountain communities and outside trading partners. Some women became master builders themselves, though historical records of their achievements were often lost or deliberately obscured by later chroniclers who found female technical expertise uncomfortable to acknowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that several of the most sophisticated mountain castle complexes show construction techniques and architectural details that reflect distinctly feminine approaches to space organization and domestic functionality. The children raised in mountain castle communities developed capabilities that seemed almost superhuman to outside observers. They learned to read weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, predicting storms hours or even days before conventional signs appeared. They could identify different types of stone by touch, smell, or the sound they made when struck. They developed spatial reasoning abilities that allowed them to navigate complex underground passages in complete darkness. These children often became the bridges between mountain communities and the outside world. Their unusual skills made them valuable as guides, translators, and intermediaries in commercial relationships. Some became legendary figures in their own right, known throughout entire regions for their ability to find safe passage through treacherous terrain or locate resources that others couldn't discover. The seasonal rhythms of mountain castle life created cultural traditions that influenced medieval European folklore and spiritual practices. Long winter months spent in stone chambers carved from living rock produced distinctive forms of storytelling, music, and craftswork that reflected the unique psychological states created by extended underground living. Mountain communities developed musical traditions that took advantage of the acoustic properties of their carved chambers. They created instruments specifically designed for stone environments, using the resonance of carved spaces to amplify and modify sound in ways that surface musicians couldn't replicate. These musical innovations influenced the development of sacred music, particularly the complex harmonies and acoustic effects that characterized later medieval cathedral compositions. The preservation challenges faced by mountain castle builders led to innovations in food technology that spread throughout medieval Europe. Their techniques for smoking meats in controlled cave environments, aging cheeses using specific humidity and temperature conditions, and storing grains in perfectly dry stone chambers were adopted by conventional communities seeking improved food security. Medical knowledge developed in mountain communities often surpassed the capabilities of trained physicians working in lowland areas. The combination of practical experience treating construction injuries, knowledge of high-altitude medicinal plants, an understanding of how environmental factors affected human health created medical traditions that were remarkably effective by medieval standards. And so we reach the end of another quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. The mountain men who carved castles from living stone, the desperate knights who chose patience over politics, the obsessed builders who spoke to granite as if it were an old friend. Their stories remind us that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come not from those born to greatness, but from those stubborn enough to chip away at impossibility, one strike at a time. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the Alps, their empty chambers still echo with the sound of hammers on stone, and dreams carved into eternity